This little club of yours that follows you around, what's it called?
The He-Man Woman Haters.
So, being a person with a uterus in America right now sucks. Actually, just being a person in America sucks. No one should live here. If you don't know about the war over reproductive rights going down over here right now, basically it was leaked to the public that Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito drafted an overruling of the 1973 case of Roe v. Wade and 1992's Planned Parenthood v. Casey, two landmark cases that solidified the right to access abortion in America. The thing about Roe v. Wade is that the case wasn't just about abortion. It was about whether or not the government has the right to dictate bodily autonomy, and it came down to the right to privacy. In America, people are entitled to a certain amount of medical privilege with their healthcare providers. This is why a doctor can't be forced to share certain information about a patient in a court of law. And in 1973, the court found that this right extended to what a person does with their uterus. This right of privacy, whether it be founded in the 14th Amendment's concept of personal liberty and restrictions upon state action, as we feel it is, or in the 9th Amendment's reservation of rights to the people, is broad enough to encompass a woman's decision whether or not to terminate her pregnancy. Roe v. Wade didn't just concede that people have the right to abortions. It also helped reinforce that all-too-important entitlement to privacy, as ensured by one of the basic rights that the Constitution promises the American people: liberty. The government cannot infringe on our private lives. And in an age where the NSA is openly spying on all of us through all our smart devices, and Facebook is selling your personal data to the highest bidder, you would think that protecting personal privacy would be a priority for the American people. But not if you have a uterus, I guess. So, I see a lot of very obtuse people claim that Star Trek was better when it wasn't political, and my response to that is, you mean before it existed? Because even older Star Trek didn't just accidentally make political commentary, it was making political commentary on purpose. Commentary that only someone who is completely lacking in media literacy could miss. Gene Roddenberry made no secret that he created Star Trek as a way to tell parables about contemporary issues of the 1960s. He didn't just put a black woman, an Asian man, and a Russian character at the height of the civil rights movement and the Cold War on his show randomly. You're supposed to take notice that the future of humanity is integrated. Several episodes deal with social issues like the Vietnam War and miscegenation through allegory, and it's been that way throughout all of Trek. So what the fuck are you talking about, Twitter? What do you mean political? Unless, of course, you're just using politics as a dog whistle for the newer Star Trek shows have a lot more women and people of color and queer people than I'm used to and I don't like it. I'm sure that's not it. Hate to break to you, babes, but Star Trek has always been overwhelmingly leftist. And while Star Trek has never addressed the topic of abortion directly, it does seem to have some thoughts about reproductive rights and bodily autonomy. So let's tackle the latter first. In Star Trek, the subject of autonomy and self-determination are repeatedly stressed as a fundamental right of all sentient beings. In one of the TOS episodes I just reviewed, The Apple, there is a philosophical question about whether or not a small village of naive, sheltered people are better off under the facilitation of an omnipotent entity, or if they should be freed of its control. In the end, the tribe is freed and put back on the natural path of developing civilizations. Nothing in Star Trek, I think, touches on this ideal than the concept of the Borg, a hive-mind race of cybernetic beings that are hell-bent on incorporating every living being in the cosmos into their ranks and absorbing their best features in order to adapt over time into the most superior race there is, thus eventually assimilating everyone and everything into an identical blueprint. The problem is that every Borg is essentially under strict control, allowing for no individuality or independent thought. The Borg represent an existential nightmare, losing one's very being. If any one episode boils down to the importance of asserting autonomy, it's the seminal TNG episode, Measure of a Man. This one is on a lot of Trekkie's top 10 episodes lists for a very good reason. A Starfleet scientist named Bruce Maddox wishes to disassemble the android Data to study artificial life forms. Maddox sees Data as a machine, and is therefore not a sentient individual. Maddox repeatedly refers to Data as it instead of he, further depersonifying him. He also rarely looks Data in the eye or addresses him directly, choosing to speak to Picard and others as if they are Data's owners. We as the viewers think of Data as a person, even if he is an artificial life form, because he has independent thoughts, he makes choices, and despite his repeated claim that as an android he has no emotions, He definitely cares about his friends. Nevertheless, within the show, the people around Data seem to have trouble acknowledging that he is a person. When Data refuses to submit to the procedure, Picard is surprised at his objection. Data has to make Picard see his personhood and his right to autonomy, and other officers have trouble seeing Data as more than a machine as well. At one point, he's called a toaster. Data resigns from Starfleet in order to avoid the procedure. Maddox pursues legal recourse to force his compliance, trying to prove that Data is Starfleet's property. Picard challenges the JAG officer Captain Louvois' ruling and is named Data's legal counsel. Riker then has to act as opposing counsel, much to his dismay. During legal proceeding, Data is submitted to humiliating demonstrations by Riker of his non-personhood, including having his hand removed and being physically shut down. Riker even begins to incorporate the usage of the word "it" to describe Data like Maddox does. Picard demonstrates Data's personhood by asking Data to talk about why his personal belongings have meaning to him. Picard then questions Maddox and asks him to define sentience, and asks him if Data meets the requirements. Maddox and Louvois are forced to concede that Data is sentient by Maddox's own definition. Louvois rules that Data is not Starfleet property and therefore has the right to choose to refuse to be disassembled. During the episode, when Picard is troubled about how he's going to win the case, he has a discussion with Guinan, the Elorian bartender on the Enterprise. Guinan often acts as the ship's resident advice giver and confidant, but in this scene in particular, it's very significant that she is played by Whoopi Goldberg, a black actress.
Well, consider that in the history of many worlds, there have always been disposable creatures. You don't have to think about their welfare. You don't think about how they feel. Whole generations of disposable people.
He's talking about slavery.
That's how Maddox sees Data. Disposable. A sophisticated tool. Who cares that he can walk and talk and protest what's being done to him? Better to erase his personhood altogether than to confront the oppression that he's suffering as a sentient being. Another TNG episode that explores personal autonomy is The Masterpiece Society, in which the Enterprise discovers an isolated human colony that have genetically engineered themselves as a society of perfect people over 200 years. Despite the seemingly flawless community they've built, it turns out that many people are unhappy under such strict control and want to leave. Picard is duty-bound to respect their right to free will, despite the damage their absence will do to the colony's fragile social and genetic ecosystem. The ethics of eugenics is another subject that gets brought up a lot in Star Trek, and it rears its head here. Picard expresses disdain for human genetic engineering, calling it an antiquated notion, and says that he wouldn't want to live a life that was predetermined for him. The ugly side of human eugenics is that it is, by its very nature, ableist. It's mentioned there are no physical disabilities in this colony, like LaForge's blindness. LaForge discusses this with one of the planet's scientists, who confirms that in their community, he would have been terminated in the fetal stage because of this disability.
Who gave them the right to decide whether or not I should be here?
I used this scene before in a video, and at the time, there's something I didn't make clear. This scene, despite the terminology it uses about fertilized cells and termination, is not about abortion. The statement, as well as the whole episode, is about eugenics. LaForge's statement is about the right for disabled people to exist. A eugenicist, like the people in this society, would see disabled people as a burden on the community as a whole, a contaminant in the genetic pool. Oh, they might dress it up in nicer language like, well, we wouldn't want a disabled person to suffer. And that might be true to a certain extent. But eugenics comes down to breeding, and to a eugenicist, a disabled person potentially passing on their disability to their offspring would be lowering the value of the population. What I'm saying, and what the episode is saying, is that an embryo doesn't deserve to be terminated simply for the sake of creating genetically perfect offspring. A disability isn't a reason that someone doesn't deserve to live. Don't get the message twisted. The Outcast is another episode dealing with self-determination. In Rick Berman's maximum effort to represent LGBTQ+ identities without really having to show those icky gays on screen, The Outcast is a nearly transparent metaphor for gay issues, though, looking back today, it works better as a trans allegory than anything else, because it literally is about a trans person. Riker becomes acquainted with Soren, a member of the Janai, a race of people who have outlawed gender identity. Everyone is essentially non-binary. Janai individuals who are discovered to have a gender It's like getting caught with drugs. That's not my gender, officer. I was just holding it for a friend. Gendered individuals are ostracized in society and forced to undergo a form of conversion therapy. After deeming him trustworthy, Soren confides in Riker that she secretly identifies as female. The two pursue a forbidden romantic relationship, but they are eventually discovered and Soren is arrested. At her trial, she refuses to hide her gender identity anymore. She protests her right to live as she is, not who society deems her to be. To a heartbreaking effect, she is forced to undergo treatment, which irreparably changes her. And rounding out this discussion on bodily autonomy, let's talk about one of Star Trek's most controversial episodes. Tuvix. A transporter incident fuses the Vulcan Tuvok and the Talaxian Neelix into one entity, a half-Vulcan, half-Talaxian being who decides to call himself
Nivok.
Tuvix. Despite the Voyager crew missing their two friends a great deal, Tuvix bonds with them and fits in well. He establishes himself as an individual, equal to, if not more, than the sum of his parts. It seems that Tuvix is here to stay, until the Doctor devises a way to reverse the genetic entanglement. Neelix and Tuvok would be able to be brought back, but at the cost of erasing Tuvix. Tuvix decides that he doesn't wish to die. He begs Janeway to let him live, but Janeway can't sacrifice Tuvok and Neelix for his sake. Holding Tuvix at phaser point, she undoes the entanglement, bringing Neelix and Tuvok back. Tuvix is no more. This episode is highly controversial for Janeway's decision to essentially murder a man for the sake of two other people. The episode is basically a trolley problem. Allow Tuvix to live, or kill him to save Tuvok and Neelix. There is no right answer. The episode ends with everyone, including the viewer, feeling awful. So here we have several episodes exploring what makes a life, and what makes that life worthy to live freely. But in all these instances, even the short-lived Tuvix, we're talking about fully formed beings who have had the opportunity to live as people and establish an identity, not a fetus. So it's time to look at the other half of the equation. Characters get pregnant several times over the course of the Star Trek pantheon, whether of their own volition or not. Most infamous, I think, of all these stories is TNG's The Child, an episode which I hate with a burning passion. An alien entity infiltrates the ship and finds its way to Counselor Troy's cabin where she is sleeping, entering her uterus and causing her to become pregnant with itself. With the exception of Dr. Pulaski, her condition and the future of the fetus is discussed by the all-male senior staff. The discussion finally comes to an end when Troy asserts that no matter the circumstances, she will deliver this baby. She carries to full term within 2 days because of sci-fi stuff and delivers a male child whom she names Ian. Ian grows at an accelerated rate and remains elusive about why he forced Troy to gestate him. It's finally revealed that Ian is the source of the mysterious radiation threatening the ship. He willingly gives up his human life to save the ship and returns to the energy form he was before. Before he leaves the ship, he tells Troy that he was curious about organic life forms and that he presumed that the best way to learn about them was to be born and live as one of them. I really fucking hate this episode because Troy was essentially assaulted and she suffers no trauma from it whatsoever. She's like, well, I woke up and I found out some alien rapist impregnated me, but I'm fine. Later in that same season, we have Up the Long Ladder, which is about 2 human colonies who haven't been in touch with Earth in 200 years. One colony, the Mariposans, is made up of clones of the original settlers' DNA. Apparently, if you keep cloning clones, basically making copies of copies, the genetic material will deteriorate over time. The Mariposans ask for fresh human DNA samples from the crew, who refuse because they ideologically disagree with reproductive cloning. The Mariposans then attempt to steal it from an unwilling Riker and Pulaski. The matter is resolved when Picard brings the Mariposans together with the Bringloidi, the other colony, convincing both parties that they can help each other. The Bringloidi have enough people to diversify the gene pool and help the Mariposans propagate, and the Mariposans have technological skills that can help the Bringloidi advance past their cottagecore aesthetic. It's worth noting that this decision was made by a group of men. The female leader of the Bringloidi points out that the women, who will be the main bearers of the burden of repopulation, were never consulted in making the decision. Old white men dictating what women can do with their bodies. Some things really do never change. You know what? That's not fair. Men are affected by decisions like this too. Trans men. Trans men are affected. And some non-binary peeps. And some intersex people. But speaking of men having babies, let's talk about the offspring. In Season 3 of TNG, our very own Data has brought to the world a beautiful baby android named Lal. Picard is displeased that he was not consulted, and Data, naively, points out that no one else aboard has had to receive the captain's blessing to start a family. God damn it, Picard, you do with your uterus what you want to do, and don't worry about what Data is doing with his. Starfleet wants to take custody of Lal, seeing her as an intelligent machine rather than Data's child, but tragically their efforts are interrupted when Lal's positronic brain begins to shut down, and she passes away. There's also the Enterprise episode Unexpected, in which Tucker gets pregnant with an alien's baby, though honestly the less said about arm nipples, the better. But if these episodes have one thing in common, it's the fact that they all kind of dance around the issue of abortion. Because abortion is hard to talk about. Despite what conservatives claim, no one is actually pro-baby murder. But when does a clump of cells go from just being a part of the carrier's body to an actual human life? That, I'm afraid to say, is simply a matter of opinion. But surprisingly, the closest that Star Trek ever comes to directly addressing a woman's right to choose is in the original series. Let me explain. In attempting to beam down to the isolationist planet of Gideon, Kirk finds himself alone on a replica of the Enterprise. He wanders the ship until he encounters a strange woman from Gideon named O'Donna, who claims she doesn't know what's going on. She tells him about how Gideon is horrendously overpopulated due to the lack of illness and death. Kirk realizes O'Donna knows more than she's letting on, but suddenly she falls ill. Gideon's ambassador Hoden reveals that O'Donna is his daughter, and refuses to let Kirk treat her. He seems thrilled that O'Donna has caught a strain of meningitis from being exposed to Kirk, and that she's soon to die from it. The Gideon people wanted the illness in Kirk's blood to introduce a deadly disease to their population so that the citizens would begin to die off and the population crisis would be solved.
Then let your people learn about the devices to safely prevent conception.
Life, in every form, from fetus to developed being. It is against our tradition, against our very nature.
Yet you can kill a young girl.
You see the failing of logic here, right? That this planet cares more about fetuses, theoretical life, than the actual living people who are suffering. While you're in the womb, you're the most important thing in creation. Once you're born, welcome to the world. It sucks, and you're on your own. Don't expect the government to care about you. The people of Gideon want to keep Kirk prisoner so they'll have a constant supply of meningitis on hand. Kirk naturally refuses. O'Donna changes her mind about wanting to die for the cause. She is treated and survives, and Kirk is allowed to leave, since O'Donna is now able to take his place as Patient Zero. And there you have it. This episode ends with a woman deciding what to do with her own body. If the message wasn't clear enough for you, there it is, in 4x3 Technicolor. Doing research for this video, I was curious about this. I looked up whether or not shooting a pregnant woman was 1 count of murder or 2. Apparently it's only 1 count of murder unless the baby is viable, meaning that it can live outside of the carrier's womb. So, essentially the law in cases of murder is saying a baby isn't a person unless it's viable. You can't take out a life insurance policy on a fetus. Child support payments don't start until after the baby is born. Seems like to me, except for cases of abortion, there is no question the law does not see a fetus as a person. So what other component is the government trying to regulate in making these laws banning abortion? Because it sure as hell isn't human life. And the only thing I can come up with is that the government is trying to regulate people's bodies, people's uteruses, trying to force people to carry babies. I mean, you can't force someone to give up their kidneys or something to keep another person alive. So why is it any different with a fetus? I want to make it clear that this is not just a women's issue. It's because it's not just women who can carry children. But it is a women's issue in the eyes of the government. A government who is largely led by white evangelical men. And they're trying to dictate women's bodies. It comes down to controlling women. It's as simple as that. And it doesn't matter how much you chalk it up to, oh, well, it's about protecting human life. Because if that were true, we would have stricter gun laws. We would have universal health care. We would have more social systems in place to keep actual living people alive and, not, fighting for their lives, paycheck to paycheck. And that just isn't happening. Every time somebody tries to put something like that in place, it's shot down immediately by conservatives. So, the fact that this is the hill that they're willing to die on proves that they don't give a damn about human life. It's about controlling women. It's always been about controlling women. Star Trek was not only of its time, it was ahead of the curve. And here we are, over 50 years later, walking backwards.